The situation on the Eastern Front is not looking great right now. We've got a lot of Russian movements around Pokrovsk. Could you take us through a little bit what's happening? Because is this just sort of the inevitable meat grinder that is Russia, war of attrition gradually pressuring on? Or is this sort of the Ukrainians are seeing setbacks because of ammunition shortages or something?
There's never actually been a lull. The Russians have been after Pokrovsk for many months now, I think closing on almost a year. The fact that it's still standing and they've not been able to take it over, they've taken some parts of it, is an indication of how poorly things have gone there. But clearly, if you keep sending waves and waves of these expendable troops against the front, eventually you're going to succeed. And the other thing that, of course, the Ukrainians have to address is the fact that it's a multi-front war. They've got really fierce fights near Kharkiv.
This is The Global Gambit.
So just as it seemed as though things were getting better for Ukraine and Kyiv, with Trump seemingly U-turning and Russia's economy looking pretty tight and facing some economic headwinds, now things are looking quite tense for Ukraine as well. In the past 36 hours, we've had some rather disturbing developments in the form of a new law that was rushed through Parliament and many people see as a sort of autocratic direction. Others argue that it is damage mitigation from the Zelensky government and trying to deal with bodies that haven't been effective. Then there is Pokrovsk and the broader Eastern Front, where the Russians are making movements. I'm not going to say that it's massive gains or something. We don't over-embellish on this channel, but things are moving. And there was one person who I could think of that would help to navigate us through these developments in this two-part conversation, partially on Ukraine and Russia, but also China, Russia, the Middle East, and broader sort of grand strategy in the second half. It's Dmitri Alperovitch, the chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, and someone who we've had on, I think, Dmitri at this point, like 4 times, something like that. It's lovely to have you back. I mean, straight in really with one of the first questions is about these developments in Ukraine. Are they a big deal? I made a video yesterday saying that it isn't good, and other people are already saying in the comments it isn't that big a deal. It's too early to tell. What's your thoughts?
Great to be with you, Pyotr. Well, there's a number of things, as you mentioned, that are happening. First of all, the law, certainly ill-conceived. Basically, we're talking about this independent anti-corruption office that is going to be shut down as a result of this new law. There are wide protests in Ukraine as a result of it. Zelensky is sort of making some overtures towards rewriting this law, but practically speaking, the Rada, the parliament, is out of session now. It's unclear when it could be rewritten, and the effects of the law would go in pretty much immediately. So this is not quieting people down and making the issue go away. Why you would do this at this moment when the Ukrainian cities are getting bombarded by the Russians on a daily basis, and some of the largest attacks of the war in terms of drone strikes and missile strikes, when the front line in the east is really challenged, is beyond me. There are some allegations I've heard from Ukrainians that this anti-corruption office was getting really, really close to investigating some key people around Zelensky, and this was a response to that. But look, there's just no excuse for it, and something that is not just going to undermine the unity of the Ukrainian public and support for the war policies of the president, but is going to undermine support for Ukraine and him in the West. It is a huge self-inflicted wound that he's inflicting here, and unless he reverses course quickly, it can really have devastating effects on him.
Yeah, I mean, from people that I've interacted with so far, obviously things are changing quite a lot. But on the one hand, this is, we can argue that Ukraine has made remarkable steps in the past 3-4 years to try to deal with corruption. But at the same time, on the other hand, it is systemically or historically a very corrupt country, right? It's, I think, second to only Russia, if you count Russia in Europe, in terms of corruption index, I think by Transparency Index or something like that, right? International. But, can they realistically rebuild this trust? Is this a political maneuver by Zelensky, or do you think that these are people trying to push the narrative in this war, and it's just, a case of control and then maybe sorted out after the summer recess?
I don't think it's going to die off, because clearly this is highly unpopular within the country. It's highly unpopular in European capitals. Here in Washington, they need to pull back from this, or they're really putting at risk everything from the war to the unity of the nation. Look, Zelensky's popularity has been falling significantly over many months and years now. His sort of great cardinal, if you will, Andriy Yermak, who's the chief of the presidential office, is viewed as the real power behind the president, for better or for worse. He may have to fall as a result of this. Someone's going to have to take the blame, or things are going to get much, much worse.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the EU and Washington. Now, obviously, there's a big divergence now in the transatlantic relations and approach to Ukraine, or maybe it's improved because of Trump's seeming shift, although he could do it again. To be honest, I never know what's going on. But I'm quite curious how you feel about the Europeans. One particular emphasis I saw that was worth noting is that they would potentially even consider sanctioning Ukraine or completely pause the EU accession process for Ukraine. Not that it's a short-term near development likely, but, are these serious pressures from the European Union, or is it a lot of hot air?
I think they are serious. People are really upset. Corruption has been the key issue that everyone, including the United States, has been pressuring Ukraine on for many years to deal with corruption, even in the midst of this war. The Ukrainians have always been saying, wait, till the war is over, then we'll deal with it. And no one was taking that as an acceptable answer, because, of course, corruption undermines the war effort, and you have to deal with it in pretty harsh ways immediately. And they've not done a good job of it. And this is a huge step backward as well. So I do think that this has serious potential to undermining support for Ukraine. Why would you send it money? Why would you send it weapons if you feel like it's going to go in the wrong hands, right? Then it's going to be sold off or whatever. There's no indication the weapons have been sold off, but there's certainly a lot of money that the Europeans are providing directly. There's funding this government that is paying people's pensions, that is paying the salaries of the soldiers. And if that money is being diverted into the pockets of people that are getting rich off of it, there's going to be much less interest and political support in Europe to keep sending that money.
Yeah. Now, pivoting a little bit, obviously this is coming at a time when Ukraine, well, we're seeing prisoner swaps continue. We're seeing the suggestions of peace talks being reignited. People, again, on one perspective, might argue that this is about optics, but they don't actually expect to deal with the devil, so to speak. But do you think that this is growing pressures for Ukraine? Not to mention the casualty figures that are coming out, the reality of just how many Russians may have been killed, but also Ukrainians, right? Even more than we thought.
Well, look, Pyotr, we've talked on this podcast, I think, a number of times about these peace talks, and my view has been consistent that peace is not likely to happen anytime soon, as long as two things are true. One, that Vladimir Putin still has maximalist objectives in terms of a conquest of territory, in terms of political reforms in Ukraine that he wants to insist on, that would weaken Ukraine as a nation and make it more susceptible to Russian interference. And as long as he believes that he can accomplish those goals on the battlefield, which today he does. And as long as, on the other side, the Ukrainians don't want to surrender to those egregious terms, which they don't. So as long as that remains to be true, you're not going to have peace, and the war will continue. And I think it can go on for quite some time. You just had the conclusion yesterday of these third round of talks in Istanbul. I believe it lasted around 30 minutes or so. So it was not a very long session. And mostly, I think, focused on these tactical matters of exchange of 1,200 both POWs and civilians that have been captured, and then about 3,000 bodies of dead soldiers as well. But nothing practical in terms of movement on the actual peace negotiations, because the two sides are just, I think, very, very far apart. The Ukrainians floated this idea of a summit between Zelensky and Putin. Zelensky has been pushing for the summit, of course, for many, many months. No indication that Putin has any interest in meeting with Zelensky. He, of course, keeps pushing this narrative that he's illegitimate because his term had run out and he wouldn't meet with him. He refuses to even say his name. The only time I recall he has done that to any other person was Alexei Navalny. We know what happened to him. So not a good sign for Volodymyr Zelensky. And really you have, these talks probably continuing in some form and fashion. There's discussions about maybe continuing them virtually instead of, flying to Istanbul in the case of the Russians, and in the case of Ukrainians, going by train for 13 hours to Poland and then flying to Istanbul for a 30-minute meeting. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you can do it over Zoom or what have you going forward, and they'll probably do that. But the idea that it would move things significantly, I think is very unrealistic. If you look at the composition of the Russian negotiation team, it's led by this guy, Medinsky, who is basically chief of propaganda for Putin. He is the one that's sort of the ideological force behind this idea that Ukraine is not a nation, that it belongs to Russia, that has been pushed on for many decades now, several decades. And this is not the guy that you want to send in if you actually want to achieve peace. Putin, I think, still feels quite confident that he can get a bunch of things done on the battlefield.
Yeah, I want to switch to the battlefield increasingly and want to talk about the movements around Pokrovsk in a bit, so people stay tuned for that. But quickly, what we're seeing now with the rate of drone usage, there was an interesting statistic, I think I saw it in The Economist, but it was really giving a comparison of how much drone attacks have occurred in this year compared to last year, for example. So for people, the monthly averages in 2024 was about 960. And this year it's 3,500. What's that? A 4 times increase, more or less. What's your takeaway from the real increase of drone usage by the Russians? They seem to be taking some inspiration from the Ukrainians even, but is this something that is sustainable for Ukraine to defend against?
Well, both sides have been ramping up, of course, drone production massively. You're not talking about millions of drones that are being produced every single month on both sides. A whole slew of drones from small FPVs to longer range drones and these Shahed drones that the Russians call Garan, which, Shahed is probably a misnomer name for them at this point, because while they were based originally on the Iranian Shahed designs, they've been improved quite massively by the Russians. They now have jet engines. They've added all kinds of stealth capabilities to them, multi-com channels, lots of things that the Iranian drones never had. But yeah, this is the new nature of warfare. And in terms of evolution of the fight, some of it is driven by just shortages of ammunition, right? And artillery ammunition remains a big problem for both sides. The Russians are producing much more of it than Ukrainians, and they're getting more stockpiles from North Koreans, but nevertheless, they don't have enough. And drones are somewhat decent way to compensate for some of the missions that you use artillery, not all. But you also can do new things with drones. And one of the more interesting ways in which drones are being used now is particularly with these fiber optic drones that the Russians really pioneered last year, and now everyone's using them, is to be able to essentially have remotely deployed mines effectively, or these ambush operations that you can do with drones, where you can fly a drone to a particular location. It could be a road that is used for resupply, or some other important strategic location, and just set it down and wait for hours potentially. You couldn't do that without fiber optics because the battery would be used up very quickly when you use RF comms to send the video signal back. But with fiber, those requirements on power get reduced significantly. So it could sit there and line wait for a car to go by that road or another strategic target to appear, and then you hit it right as it gets close to you. And that becomes very, very problematic for resupply. That's probably the biggest issue that these drones are causing for both sides, is that it's becoming very, very difficult to resupply the front. All the approaches to these trenches are being constantly monitored. That's why you see these huge net deployments on these roads to try to prevent the drones from getting in. It's an imperfect mechanism because you could sort of get one drone to cut through the net and a second drone to fly through. The nets don't go all the way to the ground, so you can kind of go underneath them sometimes. So it's not perfect, but it's able to reduce the threat somewhat, which is why both sides are using it. But a huge issue. And now you're starting to see some evolution as well with using drones for attempting to resupplies, right? Delivering meals and other critical supplies to the front by dropping them from drones, or using ground vehicles for kind of medevac to evacuate wounded from the front. So drone warfare is improving remarkably for both sides. And the challenge the Ukrainians have is really competing with the Russian production, because the Russians, of course, have numerous resources to stand up large factories. It has a bigger population that they can conscript into these factories, or not really conscript, but incentivize through payments to work there. And they're able to in large part to outproduce the Ukrainians.
We know what happens when you try a mass conscription, right? It doesn't exactly go over well with the Russians, but
they're paying people. Conscription was the wrong word to use, but they're paying them.
No, I understand. I'm just amused at the point because clearly, Putin knows what happens if he tries a partial mobilization or forced conscription, right? But just
I'll tell you, Pyotr, I've been personally surprised that we're 3.5 years in, and the number of volunteers that you're getting on the Russian side in this incredibly brutal war, right, where you've had well over 500,000 dead and irrecoverable casualties on the Russian side, even by the most conservative estimates. Irrecoverable meaning so seriously wounded that they cannot go back to the front, egregious injuries. And yet, 30 to 40,000 men a month continue to volunteer because of these great payments that they're getting. In some cases, almost $30,000 sign-on bonus, $65,000 death bonus. And there seems to be no shortage of people that are willing to sign on, even though there's, almost certainty that within a month as a new recruit, you will die on the front line, right? It is almost certain death to sign up, and yet they do. It's remarkable. I don't think anyone could have predicted that 3.5 years ago.
Fair point. Now, you mentioned North Korea, and you've also said that Putin's, regime is getting increasingly brittle. I think you called it like a giant North Korea. And these payments do you think that's a reflection of that growing desperation, but also how unsustainable this is for the economy? I couldn't think of the word earlier, but overheating, right? I'm not going to be someone who says the Russian economy is imminent of collapse, but Putin is saying these public statements that we might have to, in a year, 2 years, look at addressing the budget, right? What was that, 3 weeks ago? That's quite a big statement for him to say.
Yeah. Well, he's been saying that actually for several years now, and the budget, of course, has not been cut because it can be cut as long as you're prosecuting this war. So that statement is not unusual for him to make, but it shows clear indication that the economy is under pressure, the budget is under pressure. They've been burning through their national wealth fund, the liquid parts of that national wealth fund, to fund these huge deficits. That fund is getting really low on liquid assets as well, but they're liquid, so they're not of much use. So it's a huge problem for them. There is more and more concern amongst the Russian economists, the finance ministry, certainly central banker Nabulina, that things are on an unsustainable path, and at some point they'll break. When that point is going to take place, no one really knows, but it is not, I don't think it's possible for Putin to continue this war for another, I think that's probably sort of a max, term. So it's going to have to end sooner rather than later. And look, we'll see what happens. If he's not able to achieve significant progress on the battlefield in the next year, he may sort of look at this and say, you know what, I've tried this really hard. It's been 4.5 years. It's time to bring this thing to an end and try to get something in the diplomatic sphere that I couldn't get in the military one. And I'll have to pull back from my maximalist demands. He's not yet there, but at some point it's likely that he will get there unless the Ukrainian front completely collapses, which I don't think it will.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, talking about front lines, obviously there are movements around. I don't like to pretend that things are sugarcoat things, right? The situation on the Eastern Front is not looking great right now. We've got a lot of Russian movements around Pokrovsk. Could you take us through a little bit what's happening? Because they seem to be I think last time you were on, there were developments around Pokrovsk, sort of 5 months ago. And then there was a lull period. There were the strikes. There was spiderweb operation. There were a few setbacks internally in Russia. And now we're here again. Is this just sort of the inevitable meat grinder that is Russia, war of attrition gradually pressuring on? Or is this sort of the Ukrainians are seeing setbacks because of ammunition shortages or something?
No, look, there's never actually been a lull. The Russians have been after Pokrovsk for many months now, I think closing on almost a year. So the fact that it's still standing and they've not been able to take it over, they've taken some parts of it, is an indication of how poorly things have gone there. But clearly, if you keep sending waves and waves of these expendable troops against the front, eventually you're going to succeed. And the other thing that, of course, the Ukrainians have to address is the fact that it's a multi-front war. They've got really fierce fights near Kharkiv, near the border there, that the Russians have been trying to take also for, I think over 1.5 years now. You now have incursions near Sumy in the other part of Ukraine. So they have to redirect their relatively small forces across numerous directions, which is weakening the front around Pokrovsk and making it easier for the Russians to advance there. They had this, what I think is now fair to say, almost a year into it, a misadventure in Kursk. As you recall, I thought it was a counterproductive idea to begin with, to do this incursion. It ended up costing Ukrainians huge numbers of vehicles and, more importantly, lives for territory that was essentially lost once the Russians launched their counterattack this year with the help of the North Koreans and retook almost all of that territory, and now are pushing against Sumy there. So, the fundamental problem, we've talked about this so many times on this podcast, is manpower. And the Ukrainians have not done enough to mobilize personnel, to train them effectively, to counter the Russian recruitment. The Russians have out-recruited Ukrainians by a huge number. That's just a fact. Now, you could say Russia has a bigger population, so it's easier for them to do so. Yes, but Ukraine is still a huge country. And it was 40 million before the war, 10 million or so left. It's 30 million or so country, right? You could have, if you truly mobilize, particularly the 18 to 25-year-olds, which they haven't done, you could get a lot of men to the front. They've been refusing to do so for political reasons. And, there's only so much you can do when you've got multiple lines of attacks that the Russians are pursuing and very limited manpower. So it remains an issue. Despite all that, though, I don't think the front line is about to be collapsed. There's a lot of hype a few months ago about the so-called Russian offensive, summer offensive, that they're massing forces for it. Well, we're 2 months into the summer, and the Russians don't have much to show for it. They haven't even taken Pokrovsk. They might eventually, but even that is not a huge population center that they can claim credit for. So really, aside from retaking Kursk, their territory that the Ukrainians had attacked last August, they don't have much to show for since Bakhmut, right? Since the days over 2 years ago of Yevgeny Prigozhin taking Pokrovsk at enormous cost of probably around 50,000 casualties from his prisoners that he's recruited into that fight. So not great for Putin, not much progress. Eventually, I don't think he's irrational. He might be getting, embellished information, cherry-picked information in his reports that he's getting from his military. But, he's got two eyes and he can see that the front line is really not moving. And these things that have been promised to him, most likely by the Russian high command, have not materialized. So eventually he's going to realize that the cost that he's expending on this war is not producing a lot of results.
Now, I'm not one to be too, as I say, embellish things unnecessarily. I don't like to say anything's collapsing unless there really is an illustration of that. And I'm not going to go too far ahead and say, is this the final winter before, we might see some kind of entity here. But like the whole support and promise of these Patriot systems that were going to be delivered by the US. I saw a report, 2-3 days ago, saying that they're going to be delayed now until early 2026. Now, in this next year, winter period, are we going to see the Russians try to mount some kind of actual assault to maximize gains, and then Putin really does begin to think about negotiations because of the economic situation, and before this renewed influx of support comes for the Ukrainians, or it's too far in the future to tell?
Well, look, I actually don't think much will change. I mean, he'll continue to pursue the strategy that he's pursued for 3.5 years, which is trying to capture as much territory as he can, opportunistically wherever he can, right? So he's clearly indicated that he is not particularly attached to any one region of Ukraine. There are people that are saying, he just wants the Donbass. As long as he takes Donetsk and Luhansk, these two provinces that make up Donbass, he's good. Well, he's obviously taken Zaporizhia in the south, of parts of Zaporizhia. He's now taken a small piece of Kharkiv in the north. They're attacking at Sumy in the west. So he's going after lots of different territory, and he's now, I think, kind of shown his true colors in a very public way in the last couple of months, when he basically said anywhere where Russian soldiers' foot steps, any land that it steps on, belongs to Russia, right? So forget the historical associations for any land in the cases. It's simply a very cold analysis of whatever we capture, wherever we capture, we're going to keep. It doesn't matter what, whether there are Russian-speaking people there or not, we're going to deal with it, right? So very much a, Middle Ages conquest type of mindset that I've always believed he had. And he's clearly showing his true colors there. But, those gains have been relatively minor. Yes, they're taking territory. A lot of it is, fields and tree covers.
Hay bale.
They're not major population centers.
No. I guess the last question I have for you before we pivot to more the Middle East and Russia by extension kind of section is, we've seen in the past couple of weeks some quite interesting developments elsewhere. Obviously, the situation in Syria, Russia doesn't have any ability to do anything there. No, not that it necessarily would in a different context. But also Azerbaijan, Turkey, and this whole situation with Armenia. And basically, we're seeing illustrations around the world where issues that Russia might have been, or Putin specifically might have been much more vocal about or focused on being proactive and doing something, intervening or whatever, they're not. Is this an illustration of Russia's growing inability to exert influence in the way that it once did, or at least could perceive that it once did? Or are these things overblown?
No, I think it's absolutely true that its ability to show its allies, like Assad last year in Syria, like Iran just a few weeks ago in the war with Israel, like Armenia that has lost Nagorno-Karabakh, this disputed region with Azerbaijan, that it's got its back is non-existent because most of the active duty force, most of the weapons are in Ukraine. So even if Russia wanted to help those countries, it really can't do much. And I think the Iranians are very disappointed in the Russians. I think the Syrians were before Assad fled to Moscow, and certainly Armenia. They're losing real influence, not just around the world, but in their near abroad. Now, having said that, they still are trying to make moves. Africa is really where they're being most active because it doesn't require heavy weaponry. It doesn't require huge manpower. You can sort of do that with remnants of Wagner and some of these other PMCs and a little bit of GRU. You don't need a lot of regular forces there to help support some of these dictators. It's not clear to me how strategic that really is for them and how much money you can really make from those efforts. So it's, the imperial ambitions are still there. The capability to execute on them is increasingly diminished. And I think there are real concerns in Moscow about all of these developments that are not going well, which is going to add more pressure. This is now geopolitical pressure to try to end this war if you're not making progress. As long as you think that you can achieve significant gains on the battlefield, you're going to say, you know what, we'll do that first, and then we'll come back and deal with all these other problems after we're no longer occupied with Ukraine. But if there's no end in sight and the front line is not moving in a significant way, at some point, I think you're going to look at this and say, it's time to bring it to a close. To be clear, I'm not saying this is imminent. I don't think it's going to happen in weeks or even months. But next year or two, I think we're very likely to see this war come to a close.
Wow. Quite the cliffhanger for part one. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in part two. Is that why they're seeking to potentially allow IAEA representatives to visit the sites now? I believe I saw a report July 23rd stating as such.
Yeah, look, they're concerned about a number of things. One, that there'll be even more snapback sanctions that the Europeans are threatening to do to further weaken its economy, which is already in terrible shape even before the war. The war has not made things any better.